Hello and welcome to the January Fireside Chat. Thanks for joining us. I hope you are all keeping safe and warm wherever you are. I know here in Philadelphia the temperatures are very cold and it is icy out. But we are having a virtual fireside chat. No fire, you must supply your own fire. And I'm very excited to introduce our speaker and our interviewer tonight. Before I do, I'll introduce myself. I'm Dr. Jessica Roney, and I am the director of the program in Early American Economy and Early American Economy and Society, or PEAS, which is one of the academic programs at the Library Company, which is behind me in its early building from the late 18th century. And and this is a program that we're putting on for you tonight. Before I tell you about it, though, I do want to let you know about some of the other events coming up at the Library Company in the near future. This Friday, January 30th at 1:30, our visual culture program is putting on what looks like a really interesting talk. I think over 200 people are already signed up for it. Episodes from a Flood of Pictures, which is a book talk from Dr. Michael Leja. And then on February 9th, we'll have our next fireside chat. What's Guinéen got to do with it on Haiti and 20th century Caribbean anti-colonialism? So that's going to be really cool. And then on February 19th and 20th, we have a 2-day conference that our program in African American history is putting on, that we are co-hosting at the Library Company. We are co-hosting with the American Philosophical Society. It is a free 2-day conference. It's going to be a jam. It's called Black Declarations of Independence. It's going to be this jam-packed event with tons of great scholars who are doing short presentations around a single item that they've found, and they're using that as a touch point to talk about Black Declarations of Independence, which is particularly timely as we go into this year of celebrating the 250th. And speaking of celebrating the 250th, we are right now in January celebrating the 200th anniversary of Common Sense by Thomas Paine. And that's a nice segue into introducing tonight's speaker, whose work is to try and understand better where sort of the political ties between North America and Britain, how they evolved over time and leading up to the era of the American Revolution, the sort of radical group that Amy describes as the Patriot Party. We're about to hear a whole lot more about that. But she is the author of this book, which doesn't want to show itself to you. There it is. Patriots Before Revolution, The Rise of Party Politics in the British Atlantic, 1714 to 1763. So she stops before we get to Paine, but she's kind of explaining the world that he comes up in. Um, and to tell you a little bit about her, Amy Watson is an assistant professor of history at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. She earned a PhD from Yale University and was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Southern California and the Huntington Library, and which is part of the EMSI, the Early Modern Studies Institute. Her research has been supported by the Massachusetts Historical Society, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Gates Cambridge Scholarship, and the Library Company of Philadelphia, among others. Her publications, aside from this wonderful book, include articles in the William and Mary Quarterly and the Scottish Historical Review. Eva Landsberg here is this year's Program in Early American Economy and Society postdoctoral fellow at the Library Company. She earned her PhD also from Yale University, and her research has been supported by the British Library, the New England Regional Fellowship Consortium, the Library Company of Philadelphia, PEAS specifically, the Massachusetts Historical Society, and others. Her in-progress book manuscript, which is fantastic, I have to tell you, we had a workshop on it just last week, explores the Caribbean roots of the American Revolution, especially looking at the Molasses and Sugar Acts. So that is something to look out for in the future. But for now, I will turn it over to the two of you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks for all of you for being here today, especially Jess Roney and Eva Landsberg at the Library Company and Grace Harrington for organizing this event. I had a wonderful 3 months as a peace scholar myself when I was in graduate school, which proved like really foundational to writing this book. So I know that it is a very, very special place. I think I will just share my screen now and give a little kind of overview of the book, what I'm trying to accomplish with it. See if I can open it up to Eva after that. Okay, let me just get organized here. Okay. So, as Jess already mentioned, I am here to talk about my book, Patriots Before Revolution. As Jess already mentioned as well, this is a really excellent year to be talking about the American Revolution because we are commemorating this 250th anniversary. And in this war that we are commemorating this year, the revolutionaries, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John and Abigail Adams, they all called themselves patriots. With my book, I trace the origins of the Patriots, the political group that really jump-started the revolution. But I will be making what is maybe a surprising claim. I argue in this book that the first patriots were not American revolutionaries seeking independence. Instead, they were British politicians who wanted to create a stronger, more prosperous British Empire. So on this slide, this is also the cover of my book, you can see a political cartoon by William Hogarth that shows the role that British patriots played in fueling this revolutionary turmoil. In this cartoon, the city of London is burning. On the right, there's a globe that is on fire, representing the British Empire. While some Britons try to contain the blaze, the British patriots, one of whom, William Pitt, is on stilts, you can see, they are fanning the flames ever higher. Ultimately, I argue that the British patriots really did light the world ablaze. So let me just talk for a few minutes about who these first patriots were. Okay, so first things first, what do I mean by that term, patriot? Today, we tend to think of patriotism as akin to nationalism or pride in one's country. And in the 18th century, patriot meant the exact same thing as it does today. But it had a second, more partisan meaning as well. This label was first adopted by a group of reformist British politicians who stood opposed to Britain's first prime minister and the leader of the Whig Party, Sir Robert Walpole, who is pictured here. This political group named themselves Patriots because they claimed that they, in stark contrast to Walpole and the Whigs, were acting strictly out of a desire to better the country. Using the label Patriot, then, was really just a piece of extremely savvy political marketing. This Patriot Party originated in England in the 1710s and 20s, but it very rapidly spread to Scotland, Ireland, the British West Indies, and of course, British North America. That brings us to the book's next big question. What did these British patriots believe in? What did they want to achieve? Well, as I already mentioned, the Patriots' original mission was not revolution or American independence. Instead, it was British imperial reform. More specifically, the Patriots wanted to create a British Empire that was militant, expansionist, confederal, and free. So let me break that down just a bit. First, militant. The Patriots had a very interventionist foreign policy. They sought to expand British trade in the Atlantic world, particularly to Spanish America, and they were willing to go to war if countries like Spain refused to trade with them voluntarily. They firmly believed that a good war, when fought for particular economic aims, was better than a bad peace. Second, they were expansionist. The Patriots believed that the British state should take a more active role in promoting British economic growth through investment in areas like infrastructure, the development of new industries like silk production, and the reduction of commercial taxes. Third, confederal. The Patriots believed that the best model of empire was a more decentralized one in which local institutions like colonial legislatures and courts held greater sway. Fourth and finally, free. Free constitutional rights that they believed that Britons on both sides of the Atlantic were entitled to. The most important of these were the rights to religious freedom, free speech, habeas corpus, and trial by jury. Now, to implement their ideological program, Patriot leaders built what I argue was Britain's first empire-wide political party. They spent enormous time and effort creating a party organization that would reach as many people as possible throughout the Atlantic world. This party organization had a press wing, including newspapers like the two shown here on this slide, as well as pamphlets, plays, and even songs. For example, the British patriotic song Rule Britannia, that was originally written as a piece of Patriot propaganda. The Patriot organization also included a dedicated party leadership, with a cadre of politicians who dedicated their careers to turning Patriot ideas into British imperial policy. The most important of these early Patriot leaders were all British members of Parliament, such as William Pulteney, Admiral Edward Vernon, who Mount Vernon is named after, William Pitt, who Pittsburgh is named after, and James Oglethorpe. Finally, this organization included a serious public outreach campaign, with Patriot leaders working directly with city corporations and trade groups to win mass support for their movement. In particular, the Patriots focused their recruitment efforts on the growing population of Britons who lived in cities. This included British cities like London and Glasgow, as well as North American cities like New York and Boston and Savannah, Georgia. By the 18th century, these cities' economies were intimately tied to Britain's Atlantic trade. So the Patriots' message of imperial reform and economic expansion was very appealing to many people living in these centers of imperial commerce. The Patriot Party did especially well with urban artisans and tradespeople of small to moderate means. So, for example, apprentices and shipwrights and shopkeepers, and also independent merchants and professionals. The Patriots' focus on public outreach was a key reason for the party's astounding success. Decades before the Stamp Act or the Tea Party or Lexington and Concord, the Patriot Party had already amassed a network of supporters on both sides of the Atlantic. Okay, let me just end my little overview by explaining some of my larger goals with this book. Basically, why do I think the early Patriots matter? Why did I spend a decade working on this project? Well, first, this book shows that to fully understand the origins of the revolution, you actually need to go back to the early 18th century. Very few histories of the American Revolution begin before 1763, the end of the 7 Years' War. In fact, the first half of the 18th century is often treated as kind of boring, a period of stability or salutary neglect. But as I hope my book shows, the early 18th century was not boring in the least. It was actually an era of extreme political upheaval and change. The revolution did not come out of nowhere in the 1760s and 70s. Instead, it came from decades of political contestation over economic policy and civil liberties, and what kind of empire Britain should strive to create. Second, and finally, this book shows that to fully understand the origins of the revolution, you have to understand British party politics during this era. After all, American revolutionaries used a partisan language. They called themselves patriots, They called their opponents Tories, which was another political party. This was not a coincidence. It was really because they viewed that war as a struggle between opposing partisan visions of what the British Empire should be. Those on one side, the Whigs and then later the Tories, they wanted an empire that was peaceful, hierarchical, and circumscribed. Those on the other side, the Patriots, wanted an empire that was militant, confederal, and expansive. Partisanship therefore dramatically shaped the course of British and American politics in the 18th century, just as it does today. Okay, that's it for me. I will turn it over to Eva. And again, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Amy. It is such a pleasure and honor to have you here talking about Patriots Before Revolution. It offers such important insights on the label of patriot and connecting it to this much longer transatlantic history that I think so often gets left out of revolutionary narratives. I wondered, just kind of start us off, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what brought you to this project, and specifically if you set out to write a book about the longer roots of the revolution, or if that was something that emerged from your research process.
Well, thank you so much, Eva, for reading the book. It's when you're in for engaging with it so closely. I'm really excited to talk about it. I came to this idea partly because I did know that I wanted to write something about transatlantic politics. Atlantic history was all the rage when I was in graduate school, but I noticed that not too many of these Atlantic historians were actually working on politics. I think it was kind of perceived as like sort of old-fashioned or fusty at the time. Hopefully, I think that's begun to change a little bit. I think that we all see today that politics really matters, that partisanship really matters. It impacts ordinary people's lives in very profound ways. But basically, in my first year of graduate school, I was doing some reading for a class on early modern British politics, and I realized something kind of interesting to me, which was that in the 1720s and 30s, the opposition to Robert Walpole called themselves Patriots. I was simultaneously taking a class on the American Revolution with Joanne Freeman, and I began wondering if these early British patriots had anything at all to do with the later American patriots. And really, kind of the more I dove into it, the stronger the similarities seemed. Both groups of patriots were kind of obsessed with taxes. Both groups of patriots focused a lot on constitutional liberty, things like free speech and habeas corpus, trial by jury. Both groups of patriots were also really, really skilled at engaging ordinary people in the political process. Americans, too, I kind of noticed, began embracing this label of patriots a lot earlier than I really had expected them to. In New York in the 1730s, there are politicians like Lewis Morris calling themselves patriots already and using these kind of recognizably British patriot slogans like no excise, which is a reference to Robert Walpole's failed attempt to try to impose an excise tax on England in 1733. So, after a lot of research, years of reading, I became convinced that there was a book there. And I guess a decade later, here we are.
That's fantastic. And I was so delighted to see you putting so much attention on the early 1730s because I
I
think what
love the
your book
1730s. That's my favorite. Yeah.
love it too. And I think what your book shows so effectively is that there is so much resonance between some of the things happening in the early 1730s and what we see 4 decades later. And one of those moments that you point to directly is the excise crisis, which you just
Yeah.
mentioned. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to what the excise crisis was and why you see it as a turning point in transatlantic politics.
Yeah, I'm so glad I know you were interested in the excise crisis too. I saw a panel that Eva was on last year that was talking partly about the excise crisis. But for those of you who don't know, and like, why would you? It is totally under-recognized. The excise crisis was this attempt that Robert Walpole's ministry had of trying to pass a excise tax, so basically a sales tax on wine and tobacco in 1733. And as I kind of already mentioned a little bit, the excise crisis is what really convinced me that there was a book in this topic. So to me, it's really important and under-recognized. I was reading the New York Weekly Journal at the Beinecke Library at Yale. And like I already mentioned, I saw that New Yorkers, they were campaigning under this slogan of no excise. So that's really when I realized that British politics were becoming transatlantic, even though these New Yorkers were not going to have to directly pay this excise tax themselves. They were incredibly concerned about what it represented, that the Whig government was going to attempt to push the tax burden onto ordinary consumers rather than the rich landowners who had generally funded the state through land taxes before this. And the excise crisis is also super important because it really kind of shows that the so-called age of stability or Whig oligarchy was not actually very stable at all. For a month or two, England was really torn apart by this crisis. It was all that anyone could talk about. There's this really great issue of The Craftsman, actually, which is a Patriot newspaper, that talks about how you could be walking down the streets of London during these months, and you would see vendors selling excise cartoons and excise operas, and women playing this new card game in which the loser was excised. So it was really kind of this moment where ordinary people banded together, they protested, and they managed to defeat the Whig ministry's signature bill. It showed that the Patriots, as well kind of as the nation at large, that public opinion could be a powerful source of political authority because people were really responsible for overturning that bill. It was also a moment that almost lost Robert Walpole his position as prime minister. He backed down because he knew he couldn't pass the bill. But it really did come this close. People were talking about, okay, who's going to be the prime minister after him? Um, so yeah, I do wish more people would write about the 1730s and about the excise crisis in particular, because it was dramatic and it showed the British Empire that patriotism was really a force to be reckoned with.
Exactly. And I think what you also show is that that's sort of the moment that the Patriots really emerge as a more organized political party than they have ever existed before. And they're
Right.
able to spread the news of the excise tax transatlantic transatlantically. And I guess my question is, because I think you show so effectively how they spread it across the ocean and then spread it across time also. So in the 1760s, you still have people saying no excise, which is a really amazing resonance that you're able to trace over time. Can you speak to the press wing of the Patriot Party, which I think you identify as what really enables them to be so effective in this messaging? How do they come to be so effective in using newspapers in ways that other parties are not?
Yeah, great. I'm so glad you picked up on the newspapers as being so, because I do see that as really what makes the Patriots a political party, or at least as I argue in the book, what makes them an effective political party. I'd say that newspapers are really important and the press in general, but newspapers are really at the heart of it, in two different ways. First, Patriot newspapers spread Patriot ideas across space. In the 18th century, American newspapers and Scottish newspapers and Irish newspapers recycled a lot, probably most of their material from London newspapers. So, Patriot newspapers like The Craftsman and Common Sense and The Monitor and the North Briton, they really had this remarkable geographic reach. You had people reading their articles all across the British Empire. So, yeah, Americans in places like New York and Boston, they were regularly reading these British Patriot ideas and saying, hey, that makes sense to me. Newspapers were really kind of the mechanism for incorporating far-flung British peoples into this Patriot partisan apparatus. And second, I think this point is sometimes overlooked. Newspapers helped to coordinate a lot of political action at this time. So they told voters what bills were being discussed in Parliament, which is kind of a new thing, and why these bills were bad, what ordinary Britons could do in order to protest the bills. So newspapers were really responsible for the instruction campaigns during this time. That's when an ordinary person would write to their representative and say, like, hey, don't vote for this bill, usually like a city council or something like that. Often newspapers actually published the instructions that different citizens would send in, and that gave other cities kind of a template for them to follow in their own instruction campaigns. They also helped to organize parades, demonstrations. They then described those parades and demonstrations at great length so that other cities could kind of copy that and follow suit. So, yeah, newspapers and Patriot newspapers did more than just communicate ideas, although they did that. They really made widespread public participation in the political process kind of possible. The Patriots were definitely, in my view, the first British party that really recognized that power and they exploited it. Other groups did follow suit. The Whigs, in particular, realized that if you can't beat them, join them. So they started buying up a lot of these newspapers to try to fight fire with fire. But the Patriots were the first ones to do it. And it was one of the reasons that they managed to gain so much popular support in such a short period of time.
That's great. And I think what you really show is the way in which they're able to make, especially colonists in North America, feel as though they're part of something larger. And that they're not just recipients of British news, but actually participating in a kind of back and forth dialogue.
Yeah, I
Um,
think you're exactly right. It's more active than just kind of passively receiving these ideas, which I think is sometimes the way that it's portrayed.
exactly. I was wondering because some of the case studies that you point to, and for those who haven't had a chance to read the book yet, it's structured as a series of four case studies and then two chapters that give an overview of Patriot ascendance and then decline over the course of the second half of the 18th century. But two of the case studies are set in North America. We have New York, which becomes kind of a Patriot hotbed. And you do an excellent job of making a very dense, complicated, and potentially boring conflict with the governor in New York a fascinating
I mean, you
event.
don't think chancery courts are fun? No, I'm just
They
kidding.
don't get the attention they deserve. And then Georgia, which is a Patriot project. I was wondering because New York in particular really fits with a very patriot model of a colony. It's very commercial. It has a strong consumer base. It has an urban center with a lot of the kind of middling artisans and tradespeople that support patriot cause. How effective was the Patriot Party throughout the British Empire? Are there regions that don't align as well with the British vision and therefore you don't find as much support? Or do you find kind of surprising levels of support throughout the empire?
Yeah, that's a great question. Certainly, there are some regions of the empire that really do embrace this patriot movement more than others. I think, as you kind of allude to, those tend to be more urban, commercial areas of the empire. So places like New England and the middle colonies have a lot of this patriot support from a pretty early period. A lot more than more kind of plantation-based colonies, places like South Carolina and the Caribbean, obviously. I can talk a little bit about South Carolina since it's the one that I cover a little bit in the Georgia chapter in the book. So, I mean, to many white elite South Carolinians, the patriot rhetoric about creating colonies with more diversified economies, this focus on commerce and more free forms of labor, that seemed to be a threat to some of them. The Whig state, on the other hand, time and time again kind of prioritized their economic interests. When there were conflicts with other colonies, the Whig ministry almost always during this period sided with colonies like Jamaica and South Carolina. That happened with the Indian Trade Act, which I write about a little bit in the Georgia chapter, which is when Georgia tried to regulate South Carolina's trade with the Muskogee Nation. From my understanding, Eva probably knows more about this than I do, but I think it also happened with the Sugar Acts and the Molasses Acts that kind of was seen, at least in the northern colonies, as prioritizing the interests of the sugar colonies over the northern colonies. So, yeah, at least initially, I think Patriot support in these plantation-based colonies was relatively low. They were pretty happy with the status quo. It was treating them quite well. And you can see that a little bit with the differing loyalties during the revolution itself. The southern plantation colonies like Georgia and South Carolina were known to be more loyalist in terms of their sympathies. That being said, there were patriots in these places. William Beckford was a Jamaican who made his fortune through sugar and slavery. And he was really William Pitt's kind of right-hand lieutenant during the 1750s and 60s. People like Beckford, I think, tended to just pick and choose which aspects of the Patriot program that was appealing to them. They liked the Patriots' militant foreign policy often, which often sought to destroy their economic competitors in places like Spanish Cuba or French Saint-Domingue. They often liked the Patriots' constitutional rhetoric as well. So at the end of the day, I think some people did choose to kind of ignore the parts of the Patriot program that were more anti-slavery, since slavery was making them a lot of money at that time. And I would say that one of patriotism's great strengths was its kind of flexibility and its fluidity to an extent. Different places could embrace different parts of this platform. So it was really kind of a big tent sort of approach to politics, and that I think that served them well throughout this period.
I definitely noticed that, especially in your case study of Georgia, where Georgia is kind of set up to be an experiment in patriot governance, and yet it ends up having a lot of issues with politicians in Britain not wanting to give up control over the colony.
Right.
So I thought that that was fascinating. And I think overall, I mean, what you do so well in this book is to show that there really is no singular British vision of empire in this period. It's so multifaceted, both in England and across the wider empire. Um, and one of the things that you do really well is to show that this isn't just a bilateral story between North America and England. So Scotland plays a really important role here too. And I know you're working on a project on Scotland currently. So I
Well,
wondered
an
if,
article at least,
and
not a big project. Yeah.
excellent. Well, I think your Scottish case study in this book is fantastic in showing so many echoes of events that we'll later see in the American Revolution or issues that arise, military control, tax protests. So many of those are shown in your Scottish case studies in the 30s and 40s. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit to your process there. What you feel like writing about Scotland in these terms kind of makes you think differently about.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you noticed these echoes. They were really the most surprising thing I probably found in the archives was how frequently Scotland reminded me of America. I wasn't expecting that when I started looking into it. I'd always kind of thought of Scotland as sort of counter-revolutionary, kind of conservative during the 18th century. So yeah, I was incredibly surprised by these parallels. Both places had riots and severe urban unrest due to taxes that they thought were constitutional, sorry, unconstitutional rather. Both places had a lot of military violence. In both places, there was also kind of this pervading sense of unfairness, that they were being treated as less than England. So, as you kind of alluded to, I am working on a little article that's kind of on this topic right now. And it's about how contemporaries really did recognize these parallels at the time. So it looks at the historical memory of Captain Porteous, who was a Scottish captain who I look at in the book, who was hanged by an Edinburgh mob for his role in killing civilians after they started throwing some stones at his soldiers. And Porteous's ghost keeps popping up throughout the American Revolutionary period. During the Stamp Act crisis, I do briefly mention this in the book. New York's Lieutenant Governor Cadwallader Colden gets an anonymous letter threatening to hang him like Porteous on a signpost. And then after the Boston Massacre, Captain Preston was threatened in a very, very similar way. During the Boston Port Act, Lord North mentioned the Porteous crisis is actually a precedent for punishing an entire city, this time Boston, but he's looking at Edinburgh, for the crimes of some of its inhabitants. So I would actually argue that the North Ministry took the Scottish precedent a little bit too seriously. In their opinion, Scotland had eventually been quelled by just sending in the army and trying to kind of destroy any resistance through militant kind of oppression. And so he thought that that was going to work in North America too. Obviously, we know now that was a serious miscalculation, but he was really thinking, hey, it worked in Scotland, let's try it in Boston as well. So yes, the parallels are there. I found that super interesting when I started looking into it, and contemporaries brought them up all the time. There was this real sense that in the 1760s and 70s, North America was following the same path that Scotland had earlier in the century. And we know now, with hindsight, that they diverged significantly, but contemporaries did not realize that that was going to happen.
That's fascinating. Do you think that that sense that Scotland had kind of been an earlier precedent, do you think that was being actively fostered by the Patriot Press, or do you think that had kind of organically lingered in, especially a North American mindset for decades?
Well, that's a good question. I think it's probably a combination of both of those things. Some of it, like the anonymous letter to Cadwallader Colden, that seems kind of random and organic, probably. Colden was Scottish. They might have also been trying to make this play that he would recognize the historical significance of Porteous and what had happened in Scotland. I do think that sometimes in the Patriots are sometimes kind of strategic with some of this. When they're threatening Preston during the Boston massacre and the aftermath of that, rather, it seems like there is this kind of concerted effort to kind of like be like, "Hey, beware, you don't go for a royal pardon because the same thing will happen to you that happened to Porteous in Scotland." So yeah, the Patriot leadership could be pretty strategic at times about these things, but I do think it goes to show that this crisis that we kind of don't really remember today as an important moment in British imperial history was something that you could reference in the 1770s, and everyone would know exactly what you were talking about. So people in a place like Boston or a place like New York had been closely following what had been happening in Scotland and were aware of that and recognized those similarities at the time.
Yeah, the Patriots come across as an incredibly strategic organization, and they're kind of master manipulators, or they're able to capitalize on events to their own ends so
Yes, they're very
effectively.
manipulative at time. I think that is definitely accurate.
It's really impressive the way that they're able to do that. And throughout the book, there are so many examples of the ways in which they're able to kind of incite riots or incite public protest so effectively through the press, through connections with urban clubs and organizations. So many ways. And it made me wonder because they come across really as a very strategic, very much kind of a party of the people, both naturally and in a very self-fashioned way. And I wondered what moments you see as maybe missteps for the Patriots or moments of miscalculation where they're kind of out of sync with what they expect the public will respond to or what they expect the public will think.
Yeah, that's a great quick question. That's interesting to think about. I think the Patriot Party, with their really intense militarism, that was probably the issue that they proved the most out of step with. Imperial wars during this period are quite popular in theory. Everyone likes the idea of beating up on the French, for example. But when the Patriots actually took actions that required popular sacrifice, that reception was a lot chillier than they had anticipated. And the Militia Act, which is in the chapter on William Pitt, that's the kind of the most obvious example of this. The Militia Act was this really central bill that the Patriots passed upon gaining power in 1757. They had this vision of British subjects eagerly joining the militia, all like kind of desperate to show their patriotism and do their duty to the British state. So they were then caught off really off guard when that act proved pretty unpopular. As it turns out, ordinary Britons were not terribly interested to give up every Sunday to doing military exercises in case of a theoretical invasion. And they were especially unhappy, actually, about the fact that patriots gave rich Britons the opportunity to buy themselves a substitute. That really seemed contrary to this patriot rhetoric of being kind of the people's party. I would say the Patriots miscalculated again a little bit with their intense opposition to the Treaty of Paris in 1763. They had assumed that there was be this wellspring of public indignation over this peace treaty. Instead, the reaction they got was basically silence. You can almost kind of hear the crickets chirping sometimes. They were expecting people to be out in the streets marching, and they did not. As it turned out, I think fighting a 7 year long war gets a little bit exhausting after a while. A lot of Britons were tired of the extra taxes and the disruption to their traditional trade routes. So in 1759, this war is still new and exciting. By 1763, though, Britons were kind of ready to move on. I think that's certainly a moment in which George III and the Tories or the authoritarian reformers had a better read on public opinion. And actually, they have a pretty good read on British public opinion throughout the 1760s and 70s, not so much on American public opinion.
Yeah, I mean the one of the takeaways that I had from your book, and I'd be curious to hear what you think of this, is sort of that in many ways the Patriots are much better as an opposition party than they are as a party with power. They don't always seem to know how to effectively hold on to or marshal their power, as well as they are able to effectively oppose whatever the Whigs are doing. I'm curious what you think about that, but I'm also especially curious to the moment that you just kind of pointed to, which is the end of the Seven Years' War, which is when, I mean, the Patriots have sort of reached a peak of power, and yet now we're about to enter an era where they sort of lose a lot of that, and they start to become associated with a reputation for kind of political violence, rioting, this kind of more negative reputation that they haven't had up until that point. So I wondered if you could speak a little bit to that decline of the Patriots and that emergence of a more negative reputation that they had not had.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right. It's easier to throw, as an opposition party, to throw a lot of issues out to complain about than it is to actually run a government. That's a much trickier thing, and the Patriots do struggle with that sometimes. You can see that even earlier, actually, when the Carter administration really miscalculated by agreeing to a coalition government in the 1742. As a governing strategy, coalitions kind of make sense. You bring people to the table with their voting blocks. But the Patriots have been describing Walpole and the Whigs as these evil kind of puppet masters, and suddenly the Britons are supposed to believe that they're not so bad after all. It's okay, we can work with them. That decision lost them a lot of support really quickly, and actually kind of took another decade or two to build that support back up. And then, yeah, I think you're right. At the end of the Seven Years' War, 1763, and with the Wilkes kind of protest, that's another moment where their reputation and their understanding of public opinion is not quite as strong as they thought it was going to be. This is a little bit because I think the earlier Patriot leaders, they are pretty much men of respectability. They're doing some interesting things in terms of appealing to the public and these parades and protests. But at the end of the day, these are wealthy, mostly aristocratic men who have that sort of conservative respectability to them in their image. William Pitt is always portrayed as this great Roman kind of patriot of virtue. But John Wilkes is nothing like that. John Wilkes, he is xenophobic, he's rude, he likes to shock people. And that really does, I think they might have made a bit of a miscalculation embracing him so wholeheartedly. His supporters also, their forms of protest are a little bit more violent. They're not doing these stately parades where they're marching around with slogans. They're burning things. They're burning effigies of the Earl of Bute and boots to kind of represent the Earl of Bute. So yeah, that more violent reputation and embracing this really polarizing figure, it kind of works in the short term. A lot of people are very excited about patriotism again for a moment, but in the long term, I'm not sure it served them well.
Yeah, I was also wondering about the kind of Americanization potentially of the Patriot Party at this time when you start to see American protests against the Stamp Act, if that kind of contributes to this reputation in England of them being a party of the mob.
Yeah, I think that the tarring and feathering that goes with what they already thought about these protesters, which is that they were violent and that they were going to do whatever it took to express their political opinions, even if it meant innocent tax collectors might suffer as a result of that. And they're never, like, people in Britain are never too sure about the colonists, what they should think about them and their political loyalties. So certainly aligning themselves so strongly with the Stamp Act resistors, that might have been, I don't know if that's a miscalculation, but it does change their reputation within Britain a little bit as well.
Great. And there's so much more to talk about in the connections to the revolution, but I want to make sure that we get to the questions from the audience. And please, we already have a number in the queue, but please keep sending them. They're fantastic. Um, let's see. We have one from Peter, which asks, what economic and financial interests did the British Patriots represent? Were they principally merchants, manufacturers, investors in India?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of them are merchants, although I will say there's a distinction to be made between independent merchants during this period versus those who are members of these government corporations like the East India Company or the South Sea Company. The Patriots are actually pretty firmly opposed to monopolistic control of trade. They want more people to be involved in trade and for that not to be closed off to them. Manufacturing is something that the Patriots are very supportive of as well. They tend to want to make sure that there is more of that industry and new industries like silk production in Georgia, for example. They offer a bounty system in some colonies to try to promote this manufacturing as well. So yeah, basically anything based on commerce, manufacturing, having more kind of diversified economic systems, that tends to be what the Patriots support.
Think that leads very well to Michael's question, which kind of brings us to a commercial port city in the empire, Philadelphia. And Michael asks, did the Quaker atmosphere in Philadelphia at this time affect patriotism in the city? Or more broadly, speaking to kind of the religious aspects of patriotism?
That's a great question. Yeah, I wish I could have actually, when I was at the library company, I was thinking about incorporating Philadelphia into the book, and then that just never quite happened. But in another second book, maybe I'm going to be talking about more about Quakers and Patriots. Certainly, the religious aspect of Quakerism is a little bit hard to square with this patriot militancy, and there are some conflicts about that throughout this period. You see some patriot figures like Benjamin Franklin, for example, who gets very, very annoyed with the Quakers in Philadelphia because they are refusing to support some of these patriot wars, like the War of the Austrian Succession and the War of Jenkins' Ear. There's this big campaign that I talk about a little bit in the book to capture this French port called Louisburg, which is in modern day Nova Scotia. And basically, Pennsylvania is the only colony in the North, at least, that does not send money for that expedition. And that gets a lot of patriots very upset because they think that they are funding this great effort to try to stop the French from taking Canada. But Pennsylvania is not helping with that effort. So, yeah, I think that's a great question. And I would love to explore that more in a future project, looking at how those religious beliefs impact this political ideology.
Yeah, the war hawkishness of the Patriots is really one of their most amazing
They
consistent features.
They love their wars. Yeah, so I think sometimes people wonder whether I like the Patriots or not. I'm like, well, there's certain things they're doing that are great. Habeas corpus, can't complain about that. I'm not sure about starting wars with everyone. That seems to be kind of their favorite thing throughout this period.
Yeah, to fight you into trading with you.
Right. Don't have a choice.
We have another question in the chat from Jeffrey Jones, who's working on a dissertation on British imperial politics and culture in Belize on the Mosquito Coast. Um, and Jeffrey asks, how do you think the Patriots would have defined confederal empire in places outside clear colonial boundaries, like slave societies and indigenous borderlands?
It's a great question. Unfortunately, I would say the Patriots do not consider enslaved people or many of these indigenous societies part of what they consider to be the political nation. There are times in which you can see that they are trying to trade more with indigenous peoples in the American Southeast. They do want to stop some of the problems with those trade in which they feel like the Muskogee Nation in particular was being treated poorly by South Carolina. But they never really talk about what can we do to incorporate these people into the political nation. That is not something they're particularly interested in. Many of them probably do not view these individuals as, equal to British citizens by any stretch of the imagination. So I guess I do want to make sure that I distinguish that these are people who are expanding the political nation, but only to middling white commercial men for the most part. So yeah, these kind of borderlands, that's an interesting question, but I don't think that they perceived having authority within peoples who weren't part of this, what they conceived of as the British political nation.
I'm going to jump in and ask a question.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed your book, and I really enjoyed your conversation. Your this question about confederal. Um, well, this isn't really the question I'm going to ask, but it's making me think about the tension between the desire to reform and the feeling that like from the center is where the reform should happen. We're the ones who understand and can see all the different parts, and so you should listen to us, versus this idea of self-rule and the way that confederal government is a really difficult thing to pull off, actually, especially if you are trying to move in unison and gear up an entire system on behalf of war-making powers and so on. So it's very interesting. Like it's one thing to kind of vaunt it and then another really to govern. And maybe this goes actually back to Eva's point about are they really better as opposition than in government? You know, that the problem of actually ruling and getting something done becomes very different when if you really are invested in confederal government.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a good way of putting it too. I definitely think that the Confederal government piece is sometimes the first thing that gets dropped when the Patriots are confronted with issues with governance. The big example to me is actually in the Georgia chapter. The Patriots have been talking this great talk in places like New York about, making sure that colonial legislatures have real power. But in Georgia, you have these trustees who are all English, or a few of them are like Anglo-Irish, who come in, have no understanding of the on-the-ground realities of what Georgia is actually like, and they are determined that they're going to completely run things. They don't let colonists there vote for officials. They decide who all the officials are going to be. They appoint them themselves. A few colonists began protesting this, and some of it, to be fair, is, the colonists are trying to overturn this prohibition of slavery, and patriots know that, so they don't want them to be in charge. But also, you do have some cases in which people are directly addressing James Oglethorpe, saying, "When do we get to vote? Isn't that a thing that you support?" And he essentially says that no, you are too poor and ignorant in order to make decisions about the life of this colony. So yeah, you can see that as this moment where patriots are saying one thing to try to gain support in various places like New York. But when they're actually put in charge of a colony, they don't want ordinary people to be running the show. They want to be the ones calling the shots. And you could maybe argue that that is because they're trying to wait until Georgia becomes advanced enough that they can run themselves. But that seems more like an excuse, I would say, than anything else.
Well, for whatever it's worth, it's still true past the American Revolution. I mean, that's the whole point of the Northwest Ordinance. You
Right.
cannot govern yourselves. We will give you your elected or unelected officials. We will give you your officials. We will give you your laws. We will veto anything that we feel like vetoing. So confederal is really easy to promise. It's a lot harder to live up to.
It's a great campaign promise, and they get a lot of out of that. But yeah, I think when they're actually in charge, they don't usually put that into practice.
Can I sneak in one more question?
Yeah,
The one I really wanted to ask, actually, I was thinking about Pitt, who's on your cover here, on the stilts, f- fanning the flames in this cartoon.
right.
Literally,
The
the world is
bellows.
on fire. There's a globe, and he's fanning the flames of the fire on the globe. And I was thinking about how much George III hated him, and how, sort of
Yep.
where George III comes into your story. He's not a patriot. and it's partly because of his own education and who he knew as a younger man who was really influencing the way that he thought about the world. But I just wondered about personal relationships. Like you were talking about Wilkes as a maybe we shouldn't have been. Like maybe he was a little dodgy. Like I just wonder, was there ever a world or is there ever a path where George III could have been more sympathetic to the ideas of the Patriots and would that have changed things? I don't know. How much is personality
I don't think
or certain
personality
interpersonal
does matter.
relationships to blame here or to explain things?
Right. I think that George III's accession to the throne is a huge turning point, and that's surprising that one person coming to the crown at a time where up until this point in the 18th century, the crown's not playing much of a role in domestic politics, or at least not a huge one. It controls some things in terms of foreign policy, certainly. You're exactly right. George III hated William Pitt. He's already strategizing before he becomes the king about how to get him out of power, actually. There's some great letters between him and Bute in which he's talking about how, like, Pitt is not paying him enough respect and that he's not actually going to fire him, but he's going to do his darndest to make sure that Pitt is so uncomfortable that he will resign, which is ultimately what happens. So yeah, I think there's an interesting alternative history about what would happen if his father hadn't died when he had. Prince Frederick was very kind of patriot aligned and had a lot of sympathies with his patriot program, invited a lot of patriot politicians to his court, put them on his payroll. If Frederick had been the next British king, I think you could have seen the British Empire going in a very different direction. I certainly don't think that personality is the only thing that matters. I don't want to tell some sort of like big elite man kind of great man history here, because ordinary people obviously had a huge role to play in moments like the excise crisis or the Stamp Act crisis. But certainly, I think that George III and his antipathy towards the Patriot movement, that did at least kind of tip the scales one direction.
Yeah, the contingency of your story is so clear, especially once we get to the 1760s. Um, Amy, this has been fantastic. The one final thing I'll end on is I really think that this work should be required reading for all students of the American Revolution in
Oh,
terms of
thank you.
understanding the label of patriot wasn't one that emerged in North America in the 1760s. It has this much longer partisan history. And so I guess my final question for you would be, should we expect the next book on the Tories? I mean, do they have the same long history too? Um, but beyond that, this is such a fantastic book. If for those who haven't read it yet, highly, highly recommend. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Maybe Tories would be a good second book. Actually, I'm writing an article right now about what some of the Tories thought during the 1720s with the Anglo-Spanish War. So yeah, maybe there could be a Tory second project. I like that.
There we go,
They
Justice
matter
for the
too.
Tories.
Well, thank you so much for everyone for your engagement and for paying and for reading the book. That's when you're writing a book for a decade, you hope that some people will read it and engage with it so thoroughly and deeply, as you did, Eva and Jess. So I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Amy. Well done.
You.
Thanks.